All right, back at it again. Design Huddle, the podcast where two internet friends talk about what's new in tech and design. Mustafa, we are talking web site interfaces and how to make them, more easy, more scannable. So this is like a very popular trend of like the importance of getting into headlines and how to be more concise. It gets into UX writing, but it's a broad topic. But UX design, it's scanning for readers and designing for readers. What are your thoughts? Where do we start?
Okay, so we wanted to look at some of the, I suppose, um, incorrect things that we've been taught over the years. So, way back when there was this term called above the fold, and it comes from print, and it's basically when you had broadsheet newspapers, um, the ad that sat above, and the way they were folded, the ad that sat above the fold was more premium. So, and that's because people would see it when it was naturally folded in their hands. And
Right.
so when you open up the newspaper, the ad that appeared below the fold was less worthy. And this term, because a lot of web designers in the early days transitioned from graphic design, they started bringing over these terms, which didn't really make sense in the web. So this term above the fold has consistently been about. And so this brought about this idea that people don't scroll, and the way people read is because they comes from this very print um, ideology that we've had. And so looking at some research, what we find is there's actually two types of readers. Like you have the scanners, which make up a large portion. I think it's like 50 to 60% from what I can remember from like this study that was done with Slate and other news websites. And the scanners type readers, which make up a majority, what they do is they look at the header, they'll look at sort of like pull out quotes, maybe some of the images, just to almost to get an idea whether they should commit to reading. And maybe just try and grab bits and pieces. So you also have to understand the context of people reading. They might be doing some research. They might be trying to back up their claims. Because, when people have arguments, they're like, I know that this is the truth of blah. And let me try and find that one article that I found on search. And they're basically scanning. And a lot of people treat the web as this kind of utility of backing up their whatever. Be it students, people in a bar. Well, you don't have bars anymore. So you have those as a type of readers who scan, and so they will be scrolling across the whole page. So this idea of above the fold doesn't make sense in this context. It's more about strategically picking out key parts of your content that will actually allow the people to scan, to use it in this way. It's not like a good or a bad thing. This is the behavior, and what we want to do is when we're designing stuff is wrap around existing behavior. The other type of readers is what they're called methodical readers. So they're actually going to go through piece by piece and read the entire thing, and which is another thing where we assume the short bite-sized articles are what everyone wants. In some cases it's true, like when you're reading on a bus or whatever, you have a short amount of time, and so like what Medium does is they'll do like how long an article will take to read, and so more people read, so that for the scanners,
Yeah.
that's perfect. But what we're finding, and what I'm seeing more and more, not just in design, but just generally, the long form conversations people really cherish. And I think the podcasting world has seen, like, especially like the most biggest podcast is like Murder Mystery, if I'm not correct. Like, it's
Yeah.
the murder.
Yeah.
Um,
I got into podcasts through the murder mystery serial. Like that was the first podcast, and then you just go down. There's so many good murder mystery podcasts, but yeah. Anyways, derailing, but
or
yeah.
like
Go
you
ahead.
look at, say, Joe Rogan.
Yeah.
Um, he will meet with all manner of type of people, like from all, and 2 3 hour conversations, and people are listening, because sometimes you have like these really complex subjects that you do it such a huge injustice by saying here's the top 10 things of blur, and
Yeah.
so long form and the methodical people who are really into the subject, and usually it's a small portion, but in terms of monetization and that sort of thing, usually that's the audience that you want if you're selling content, or if you're in the game of being like a what do you call it, an influencer. Like, it's better to have like 1,000 buying customers than 1 million just viewers, right? So it's like having this target, and I think the methodical reader is kind of that sort of person where you're doing long form. So when designing content on your website, you really want to be thinking about these two type of use cases and these two type of users. Like the BuzzFeed thing is quite good. It's almost like if you're trying to get news out there and maybe do something viral. But then if you want to do something meaningful, that's very deep, in depth, then having the methodical. And I've seen some content creators, they do both. So on YouTube, you see this, like you do like the small clips and then the long interview. And it's almost two different audiences that it caters for. So yeah, I mean, what do you think about it?
I think, I mean, it's a really interesting topic for a lot of reasons, and you can go a lot of different ways. I think we're seeing a trend in social media to these scannability, the scanner audience. Gen Z, millennials tend not to read. That's why the story format's super popular. That's why on Instagram, you'll see these slideshows that are basically minimal text, high visuals. We use it on our own Insta handle. They're very popular because you can spend 2 minutes and have a general idea of a topic. The concern there is that sometimes when I review these, I think you're missing a lot of the meat that comes there. Like a lot of these topics have nuance, and there's exceptions to the rules, and there are edge cases. There's like things that need to be more thoughtful. So I agree. I think it's a balance. And if I as someone that's like a amateur content creator, I think that long form is where you start. That's where you anchor, and then you can always chop it up and create clips. Again, those can be taken out of context, but if they're well produced and you give enough visual cues and you have closed captioning, there's a lot of different other ways you can get about it. But one thing I wanted to flag you, and I wanted to get your reaction to this, is there's a quote that I wanted to pull. There was a question asked of like scannability and why this is important. So about a decade ago, Jakob Nielsen answered the question, how people read on the web. And the answer was simply, they don't. People rarely read web pages word by word. Instead, they scan the page, picking out individual words and sentences. Since then, it hasn't changed much. We aren't ready to invest our time and effort into exploring the website if it doesn't correspond to our needs. So I wanted to also get your thoughts. During my career, I've always felt like UX writing was kind of important, but I didn't really value it that much.
Yeah.
But I think the art of writing a good headline and subtitles is so important, but typically missed from designers. I'm just curious, do you have any experience with that? Is there anything you've learned from good UX writers you've worked with?
Yeah, well, I mean, just writers. I remember way before I was working in big tech, I worked in what they call the third sector, which is basically the charity NGO sector. This was the major thing which I worked on early on in my career. Yeah. And so I had this idea that I was, would only ever work for social organizations, never big corporates. That was all evil. And I changed very quickly when I realized how much we get paid. But I was lucky enough to work with two amazing writers. They were writers from the same way that I was always into art, they were always into writing. One actually was a published poet as well. And we used to do this training courses for young kids, teaching them how to write. So we had this template where we would work with, I don't know what the correct term is now, but it was used to be known as disadvantaged background folks. So kids, homeless people suffering from mental health difficulties. And so what the formula that we had is we would create a magazine that would highlight stories that affect these things. It'll be interviews, news, tips, and all this stuff, made lifestyle magazines or design, whatever magazines. And in the process of creating the magazine, we would teach the kids about journalism, about design, about writing, about the key things. And so it was almost like an apprenticeship. They had an applied thing at the end of it, and a physical magazine that they could take to maybe a university if they wanted to go and do this as a career, or maybe even a job, like a starting foot. So it was a really great formula that we had. And so on the writing courses, the first thing that which surprised me is that one of the writers said is the best writers are usually tabloid newspapers. If you look at the way tabloid newspapers write, the first paragraph will say the entire story in 100 words, and that is such a phenomenal skill. This is something you have to develop, and it's very hard.
Crafting a good tweet.
Yeah, exactly. And almost I remember there was one journalist recently. She was talking about how Twitter helps her become a better writer because you have to condense everything into 150 characters.
Have you ever seen those mega threads where it's basically people telling stories, but then
I hate them unless it's really important, something that's going on that explains the spread of COVID, for example, where it's in that moment you're trying to find something out. And sure, I think this is another thing which I want to talk to you about. Actually, I'm trying to come up with the correct term for it. The best phraseology I could come up with is user fudged experiences, and what that means is you're trying to design you're seeing users do something really weird with your product, and you're trying to figure out why. And we actually did one of the slideshows on Instagram. I think I may have posted it. One of us have posted it. And the idea is trying to find these experiences is quite interesting, where you see users like writing I think I mentioned this before, writing their password on a sticky and sticking it on their laptops, like the user fudge experience. It's clearly they're showing what they're trying to do. You're not catering for, so they're hacking it. Another example is, I think email discovered that people were saving really large attachments before Dropbox and Google Drive existed, and what they found was they're basically transferring files and they're using email attachments as a means to do that. And so, like, you're seeing this behavior, and people are trying to do something. They can't articulate what they want to do because that product doesn't exist. And the moment, say, Dropbox appeared, it was like this amazing piece of technology. Oh my God, I don't need to carry zip disks or CDs or all these like USB drives anymore. I just put something, and my computer is no longer this isolated device. It's this interconnected thing where my files travel with me. I mean, that was like revolutionary back in 2010. Now it's the norm, right? We expect this.
Right.
So like this user fudged experience is the phrase I'm trying to come up with, and I've completely lost my trailer.
Patent pending.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, I tried to come up with the phrase like user hacked experience, but that implies other stuff. The point I'm trying to make, or getting to, is that I mean the threads on Twitter, that seems to me like a perfect example of user fudged experience. People trying to do something, but Twitter hasn't figured out the pattern for that.
Yeah, I mean, for them, it's like Twitter should just adopt like a medium, like almost like a bio site that you could link out to for more long form blog posts, like a web experience.
Yeah,
because like
you just post the title.
If you're going more than a tweet, I also do not like the super threads. I'd rather link to a Medium article and then read the Medium article with like, you know, the 4 points that someone's trying to make. It tends to get lost, and there's also like the thing that you have to. So correct me if I'm wrong here, but like when you're doing that on Twitter, you have to have like the engagement to make the posts go above the comments, right? Because if someone liked the comment before the next post, wouldn't it go post, top comment, and then your second point? That's like I think that was my understanding, that it was like they bumped the top like highest engaged tweet to the top, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems like a very chaotic experiences, or user chaotic. I don't know. User fudged experience seems to be the most. I mean, we need to do like a slideshow explaining this on Instagram, coming soon to a post near you. But going back to like this course that these journalists used to do, and they gave the example of like what's important in writing and how you emphasize it. So say if you were to write, you know, dog bites man, that's not that really interesting. But if you write man bites dog, then that tells you, like, you know, and it's like how you actually concise an entire story about a man biting a dog into like a very, like, you know, and giving quite a lot of detail into that, and how focusing on your words. And like what I do actually for the Instagram posts that we've been doing together, like we just for you know, transparency. Well, like we write these things like snippets of design and chuck it on Instagram. But what I've been doing is opening up Grammarly, which is like the writing tool, and that's helped me so much because I'm dyslexic, so I miss out on so much incorrect grammar. So spelling your and you are like incorrectly, affect, you know, like my grammar is just terrible.
I mean, it is a pretty awesome plugin.
I open up the actual browser, and what I do is I write a whole bunch of stuff that I want to say, and then so like open up Figma to design these templates, and then so you write, and then so get it bullet point, then take it back into Figma, and because it's like you've got this concise amount of space that you want to put in there, you start thinking, okay, now it's like first part is making sure the flow and grammar makes sense as a bullet point story, and then it's like, okay, how can we make this even more concise? So taking that back into Figma and think, okay, what can we simplify the language here? The other thing is, I think why Scannability is probably quite popular on the web is a large portion of the web is speaking English as a second language, and the language of the web is predominantly English. Maybe it's changed in terms of volume. I mean, it's a hard way to assess, because if we're talking about volume, it's probably one of the Chinese languages or Indian languages. Like, because just by volume of people. But in terms of widely spoken, English is the language of the web. So therefore, when people are trying to learn something, there's an added incentive to make it scannable and simplified so that more people can understand, as well as the algorithms that translate things, which will do better if the language is simple as well. But yeah, no, I mean, again, this is all context. Like if you're trying to renew your mortgage or do insurance, you don't really want like, here's top tips for blah blah. You want am I covered if someone falls in my house? Am I covered if the building falls down? You want to know like this, and this is not something that you can really scan. And like the thing which I learned working with writers is how hard it is to see good writing because you just take it for granted, and how you notice bad writing almost immediately. Like bad grammar is like just pops out. And when I spoke to like conversational designers, they said like a good conversational design with say like a Google Home or an Alexa or whatever, it's quite, you don't see a good conversation because it's just natural. It's when it breaks down you notice it. And I think the same thing happens in writing. And so yeah, no, so this article about scannables and methodical writers, it kind of gave me hope that there are people who really want to read. It also breaks from some of these silly rules that we used to have. Like I remember back in the days, like hey, you have to get within 3 clicks or people will get tired, and there could only be 7 links on a web page. Like all this stuff is like pretty much rubbish now that we know from like 20 years of working on the web. So people do scroll. They're more likely to scroll because they're scanning. And yeah, so I really like this. I mean, what's your experience on?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it,
so that
just like work experience involves design teams as well as like the business. Like, how can your website improve some sort of business goal? So scannability also is directly tied to like business goals. So if users can complete tasks quicker and achieve their goals, users understand, like that's why it's really important to have good structure and navigation so you can quickly find what you're looking for. And it also gets into stuff that's very like basic web metrics, like bounce rates decreased, the chance of retaining a user is higher, the website gets more credibility because it looks more professional and polished and you don't see walls of text. So there's a lot of benefits of doing this. I think a little part of me thinks that this is generational. There's a reason that we get a new Vine, TikTok type social media site. It feels like every 2 years another one comes out where they're just short videos.
But you reckon that's just generational? That's not necessarily an international audience as well? Like, because one thing I discovered is like when I went to speak at an event in Dubai once, and it sounds really like posh or whatever. It's like these international jet setters. And I noticed one of the guy, one of the speakers, he kept on like speaking into like WhatsApp and recording. I'm like, it looks so suspicious. Like, I'm like, what are you doing? And like, why don't you just type? Because, well, the Arabic language is really hard to type because there's so many dialects. And when you're typing, the keyboard is not really designed for the Arabic language. And so what's very common in the Middle East is people send recorded voice messages as a way of sending messages.
It's interesting.
And the same thing happens in Asian countries as well, because when you've got this many characters, it's hard. This idea of like the way the writing works or the characters work don't really translate that well. So again, this is all assumption, right? My assumption is the reason why those apps like TikTok comes from China, right? It works because, again, the user fudged experience of keyboards doesn't work in that environment. Again, this is all theory and complete like made up. So therefore, video form and sort of this entertainment works much better because that's how they communicate. Smileys, recorded videos or audio. So therefore, maybe like I suppose Vine doesn't really count because that was like the West, I guess. But maybe that's what the appeal is.
I mean, it's a very fair like hypothesis. I think that makes sense. So it could be generational. It could be just like,
maybe
the world is flat and we keep.
Yeah, we don't want to hate on millennials.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, I totally get it. I do think there's. I don't want to get into like the dark UX of auto loading and the kind of like all the patterns of just like the continuous scroll, but I wanted to end this episode on scannability with some tips on improving scannability, because a lot of the feedback that we've gotten in previous episodes is just like, love the topic, like what can we do as designers
Yeah.
to like, fix these things. So there's a few that I have, and then I'll kick it over to you, and then we can wrap up this
Yeah,
episode.
sure.
But so some tips on improving scannability. I think number one, prioritize the content with a visual hierarchy. So basically, arrange and organize the content on the page, which is the most natural for human, for human perception. So a lot of this might be like, looking at the size, the color, the contrast, the proximity. The other thing that I would really be cautious of is the negative space. Like that can be really helpful in, making sure that titles pop out. You can put the core navigation in the website header. On mobile, I'm a big fan of actually dropping Scannability also works for navigation. So I love when apps and mobile websites bring the menu down closer to the thumbs. I'm a huge fan of that. We don't see it as much because everyone's used to the hamburger menu and the menu up top, but I think that's, something else is like really making sure that the navigation reflects what the user's goals are. There's a ton of good examples, but keeping that clear. I mentioned negative space, but this is also called white space. It's the area or the layout which is empty. So not only around the objects in the layout, but you're also between them and inside them. So negative space is kind of like the breathing room for all of the objects on the page or the screen. So really giving that, as much thought as possible. And my last one is just, check the CTA is at least seen at once. So, a lot of web pages are aimed in particular to complete an action. So just making sure that they're clear, they're easy to see, and they're like accessible is the other thing that makes. I think these are just other things to be thinking about, from a scannability. So I think scannability also goes a lot of in hand with accessibility in a lot of ways. So those are mine. But any tips that you have?
Well, the one that came to mind was you think about accessibility in screen readers. Like one thing that is done in print is to make the scannability of an article in a magazine clearer. They'll do pull-out quotes. The problem with pull-out quotes is what it does is the screen readers will read the text twice, basically, because they read the pull-out quote and then in the article they'll read it again. And so this pull-out quote sort of thing, I don't think it really works on the web. Like on a magazine, it's like you open it, say you're on an airplane, you open it, and it's there to sort of like maybe be slightly controversial to pull you in, or there's something that's in there that's like, oh, I want to, and then you won't necessarily find it straight away, so it forces you to read the whole article and it like entices you in. That doesn't really work well on the web, especially the way that we read top to bottom. So I'd be very careful about that. In terms of content type, just like if the article you're writing is a how-to, do a concise box in the front. Like if there's tips to make something or do something, like especially like technical things, like you just want to get a person just wants to copy and paste, like just how do I make something in Photoshop, bang bang bang, like tips. You can go in and do much more an explanatory thing underneath it, but just really quick it is really useful if that's what you're trying to do. So like bullet points, headers, embolden things. Make sure the font size is larger than 14 pixels or 14, because it's like anything below that people will struggle. Make sure the color contrast is considered, because people will struggle as well. And like characters per line as well. Make sure that the typeface that you choose allows for like more words. Otherwise, if something's like a narrow paragraph, it what they call the widows, like it become really really obvious. So those are spot on. Yeah, and also know that in the same way that as you as a digital designer, that's a skill. Writing is a skill. So work with a writer is probably, like in the same way with researcher. Like I can research, Ryan can research, but if you really want to get an expert and you want it to be really valuable, that's when you have to like. It's the thing of like we could all fudge it together, but there's the line between good and great. Is the great has the people who focus on these things.
It's brilliant. I think that's awesome. It's awesome feedback. So I'm sure this will be a topic we revisit, but scannability.
Experience.
The fudged experience. Hashtag. Follow us on Instagram. Let us know what topics you want to hear. We're going to start bringing on some friends and guests from various industries and interviewing them and getting their thoughts on some of these topics. But thanks for tuning in today's episode, and we'll catch you on the next one. Peace. Thank you for listening to today's episode of Design Huddle. The opinions expressed are solely our own and do not express the views or opinions of our employer.